Tiki Technical Tuesday, episode 3 of the Rhinoceros Hornbill adventure. In episode 1, we sculpted the new mug, and in episode 2, we made a plaster mold of it. This plaster mold is fantastic. In fact, we could begin slip casting right now, but there are 3 factors that I want to consider before I just jump into using this mold. First up is insurance. We put a lot of time into making this, and if I drop it and break it, all that time is lost. This is the only one in existence. The master sculpture kind of got destroyed or just scuffed up when we made this, so all my eggs are in this one plaster bucket. Secondly, I think about longevity. Take a look at this mold. This is the mold that I used to cast my glaze testers, and you may not be able to see it in the video, but this interior surface feels rough, almost like sandpaper. And that is because as you cast ceramic slip into these molds, it erodes away the inner surface of the mold. So the molds have a finite lifespan. In fact, I feel that I can see mold degradation after just maybe 20 castings, 25 castings. It depends on the detail and other factors of the casting, but 20, 25 is kind of all you can really hope to get out of a mold like the hornbill. And that's not a lot of castings, not a lot at all. The third thing is mold math. Now, we went over mold math in the last episode, but I'm going to do a quick mold math recap, and that is how many castings you can get out of a plaster mold in a day. So one mold can cast one piece a day. It can only do one really because of the science of slip casting and its ability to wick water out of the slip. Go back and watch my How Slip Casting Works episode to learn more about this. So let's go back to the numbers. One mold equals one casting a day. So if I take my perfectly good hornbill mug mold, I can cast one a day, or in 1 week, I'll have 5 castings. Now, if we magically had 10 of these molds, in a day I could get 10 castings, and in a week I could have 50. That's pretty good, right? In fact, I think that's worth taking one more step in the mold making process, and that is making a flexible silicone mold of this plaster mold. That's right, we're making a mold of a mold today. Let's get to it. The very first step is a lot of very careful measuring. I took a little T-square here and plotted out the exact size that each mold box would have to be. I'm giving myself about an inch or between a half an inch to an inch on each side of the mold, and I want to make sure I have height above the mold box too. I want to make sure that the silicone will flow over the top of these plaster pieces and give me a good half inch to an inch on the top section as well. I put everything down carefully, lots of math, and then we're ready for the next step. Okay, now that I've done all the careful measurements, I have scoured throughout the workshop to find all of the plywood that I can in order to amass enough wood to make these boxes. As you are probably aware, plywood is hard to come by right now and it's very expensive, so I'm making every little bit that I have here in the studio go as far as I possibly can before I head out and buy any more. I think that I've got enough. Now, it is pouring down rain outside. I'm not going to be able to set up the camera and cut this and keep everything dry at the same time. So hopefully through the magic of editing, you will cut to a bunch of finished mold boxes, or at least me assembling them right about now. Ta-da! Once I had all the pieces cut, I went back to my old and steady friend, the Craig jig tool. So this is a pocket hole drilling jig, and it lets me quickly join thin pieces of plywood together in a very strong, very low profile way, and it's easy to assemble and disassemble the boxes. I put them all together using either a combination of these little like table clamps that I have, or I've got these fancy pants right angle clamps that help to keep everything really, I just want to keep everything really square and exact, because that's just the way I roll. All right, we've got our mold boxes finished finally. Now, you don't need to get this fancy square edge, super fancy tool. You can make these just fine. They don't have to be perfectly square. Why am I putting all this time into it? Well, It's what I do for a living, and I want these things to be great. These are going to keep my molds casting well. If these are really well made, they will produce well-made molds. So yeah, this is an investment. Like I always say, this is an investment in my future and in this mug's future. Now, speaking of that, it is late in the day and I don't want to start pouring silicone now. I'm just way too exhausted. So we're going to come back tomorrow and be fresh and be re-energized, and we will pour our silicone and then we can start casting plaster. Okay, we are back in the studio and back on the boxes. Something I wanted to mention is while it was raining and I couldn't set up the camera, I did put several coats of crystal clear acrylic onto the boxes and sanded them back so that the wood surface is sealed. And then I'm going in and I'm writing in all of the information about which mold each box is for, because they can get separated from the molds once you're in the casting process and you want to remember which one is which. I also put these little marks on each side of it so I can remember what order the boxes were assembled. In case I have to disassemble one of these boxes and then put it back together, I can put it back together exactly how it was on the day that the silicone was poured. After we've done all the marking, it's time to put on a final coat of our favorite stuff, mold soap. I put a coat on the inside of all of the wooden boxes and on the edges, anywhere that silicone might touch, to help release the silicone and make sure it doesn't stick to the plywood. Last but not least, we lay out all the molds on a virgin piece of foam core to make sure they'll fit on the table, and we make sure that table is absolutely level. This is critical. Okay, you'll notice that I put the mold boxes down upside down. The arrows are pointing down, and that's because after we pour these with silicone and flip them over, that's how we're going to be using them. So you have to think kind of inverted for this part. They're upside down now, but that's because we're going to be pouring them upside down. I don't even know how to explain it. You'll just have to watch how this unfolds, and then hopefully you'll understand. Okay, so once I've got everything laid out, I pencil in the outlines of where things are going to go, and I actually go ahead and hot glue down the plaster molds to keep them from shifting around while the mold boxes are being put. Wait a minute, hang on, we got a visitor. This adorable guy has got just one antler, and I love him. Okay, back to work. As I was saying, I carefully hot glue all of the individual plaster mold pieces to the foam core, and then once they're all secure, I go through and actually hot glue down the boxes around them. Basically, I want to make sure that these things will not move and that they will be not necessarily watertight, but silicone tight for when we pour in the silicone rubber. I don't have to go too crazy fighting leaks with the hot glue because the silicone that I use sets very quickly and it's very viscous, it's very thick. Now, depends on what kind of silicone you're using, how careful you've got to be about patching leaks. Some silicones are very fluid and they take a long time to cure, like they might take 24 hours to cure. When that's the case, that silicone has a lot of time to find its way out through any little leaks you might have in your mold, any cracks or crevices. So make your molds as watertight as the silicone you're using demands. Speaking of silicone, this is what we're using. I guess I should have done it this way. We're using Rebound 40. It works fantastic for me, but don't just run out and use it because I am using it. Get little samplers, get little test packets. Make sure the silicone works for the project that you are going to use it for before you buy a ton of it, because it is expensive stuff and you want to make sure you've got the rubber that works for you. And since the silicone is so expensive, you want to make sure you get just the amount that you need. How do I know how much to get? I don't. Now you can be fancy and calculate volumes and whatnot, but that means that I've got to make these molds, then measure volumes, and I wanted to have the silicone already ordered. So I kind of guesstimated what I need, and then I also have this. No, it isn't candy. It is a carefully cut up old mold from a mug that has been retired. Once an edition is done, I take the SILICONE MASTER molds and I cut them all up like this because, believe it or not, you can recycle them in new molds. Okay, I think we are all set up and ready to go. I have got a ladder. I've got my recycled silicone bits, craft paper on the floor for spills. I've got stir sticks, a ton of buckets, and all of my silicone rubber ready to open. Okay, I'm gonna go for it. Now, I don't know how much video I'm gonna be able to shoot because once you start mixing this stuff, you don't want to mess around. So I'll try to get a couple of shots in between buckets. I don't think I'm gonna use all 3-gallon kits. Hopefully I just need to use 2, but it's nice to know that I've got the third just in case I need it. I definitely will be using a whole bunch of that cut up silicone that I have though to fill in extra spaces. Here we go. Yes, I wear lovely Birkenstock clogs in the studio. They are so comfortable and they can get very dirty without ruining them. Now, in my buckets, I have marked on the outside 2 lines. One is the halfway point for the A side, and one is the mark for the B side when I mix these. And since they're translucent, I can see the marks I put on the outside through the inside. I like to put the blue side in first. It is a little more, well, I guess I should say it is a little less viscous, meaning it flows a lot nicer. And I find it makes it easier to mix if you put the less viscous half in before the thicker half. Now, this is mixed 1-to-1 by volume, which is very nice, and that's why I can just follow the lines I put on the bucket instead of having to weigh this as I do it. And you can see I've already got some silicone on the floor, and that is why I like to put the craft paper down, because this is a messy process. Okay, let's talk about mixing. First of all, you do not want to use a cheapy mixing paint stick that you get from the hardware store. Those will just break trying to mix a super, super thick viscous substance like this silicone. I am using a piece of 1/2-inch plywood and it works really well. Now, I have some artist friends who are now experimenting with using paint mixers to do this, and it seems to work really well. So feel free to experiment, and if you've got tips, let me know. Now, a critical thing here is I am counting in my head 60 seconds. I'm doing a 1-100, 2-100, 3-100, and I'm only giving myself 60 seconds to mix this. Secondly, I am scraping the sides as I go. You want to make sure that you scrape the bottom and the sides so you don't have any unmixed silicone on the edge. The nice thing about this is it's 2 colors, so you can watch them blend together. Once you don't see any streaks, you know you've got it mixed well. Now, this is the bit that's going to look a little crazy. Yes, I'm standing up on a ladder to do this. This is a way of getting all the air bubbles out of the silicone as I pour it. I'm pouring in a very thin stream, which supposedly will burst all the bubbles. Maybe it's an urban myth, I don't know, but it works really well for me. Once I've gotten all the critical surfaces of the mold covered, I'm going to go in and start adding some filler in order to save my silicone costs. So I just sprinkle some of this in, being careful not to drop it on the studio floor. You may be asking yourself, am I holding the camera with one hand, adding this with the other while pouring a very expensive material? Yes, I am. Is it stressful? You bet, but it's exciting too. I went ahead and poured a second batch over the recycled chunks, and listen to the sound. Doesn't silicone sound weird? Now I'm being extra careful to get this silicone right to the tippy top of the plywood mold box. It's really important for when we flip these over that the silicone level is right at the edge and that your tabletop is level. This is why I kept saying level your tabletop before you pour the silicone. Or at least I think I said it once. Well, I'm saying it again now because it is very important. You want this silicone edge to line up perfectly with the plywood edge. Trust me, it matters in the end. After several more batches of silicone, I was able to fill up every single one of our mold boxes. Oh, so glad that is done. It is always stressful to pour silicone. It's such an expensive material and you have such limited time to do it. This is going to sit here overnight, and tomorrow morning we will pop them open, and then we get to cast our first production plaster mold. It has set. Always a great feeling to come in the next day and find the silicone completely firmly set. Now, full disclosure, I did check back on the molds, like just a mere 20 minutes after I poured it to just do a little touch test, and it already was firming up. Like I said, this stuff cures rather quickly. Now, before I start peeling these things apart, I want to just address the little chunks that I dropped into the silicone. Sometimes they will float up and you'll see they just kind of distort the surface just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and trim those high areas away, because when I flip these over and cast them, I don't want these little high areas to distort the mold in any way whatsoever. Am I being overly cautious? Maybe, but you know what? That's okay, because I want these to cast really, really well. With that out of the way, it's time for the dessert of silicone mold making, and that is
beveling the edges. We do this because it is oh so satisfying to do, and it helps the molds when they have to slide back into their plywood jackets. I like to do the top parts of the molds before I even take them out of the plywood boxes. It just makes it easier, and it kind of spreads out the joy of trimming and beveling. Once the tops are beveled, it is time to break out the muscles and pry all of the boxes off of the hot glue that is holding them down. And then whoa, did I just drop that? I did drop it, and this is a perfect example of why we make Silicone Master molds. I can drop it on the floor without fear of it exploding and making it impossible for me to do any future castings. Because of the magic of silicone, everything is fine, and I went ahead and just pried the rest of the mold boxes and the freshly poured silicone off of the foam core and got ready for a whole nother round of edge beveling. With the molds flipped, now remember they're actually right side up now, I go through and I bevel the inner edge first, the edge that is the plaster side, and then once that is done, I switch into all of the outer edges.
Okay, this bit is important. Now we have arrows on here so you know which way is up, but we also want to make sure that when we take this out of the mold, we remember what direction we have to put this silicone back into it. So I'm going to put a little notch right here in the silicone and then put a little Sharpie mark on the wood so that I always put the silicone back into the wood in the proper orientation.
Do not be alarmed, this little notch I'm cutting out of the silicone will not affect the casting in any way, but it will definitely help me put this mold back together during the casting process. With all of our bevels cut on the top and bottom and our little orientation notch put in and marked, it's time to take the rubber out of the plywood jacket. I do this using the Craig jig screws. I back them out and then I kind of just use very gently this paint scraper to just kind of pry the wood away from the silicone. The silicone does not stick to the wood because of the mold release we use, but it does have just a slight grab that I have to just kind of break this little seal. Once the silicone is out of the plywood jacket, I just kind of ease the edges away from the plaster, flip the mold over, and let gravity do the work of pulling the plaster out of the silicone. If you remember, when we poured the plaster mold, one of the batches was a little thick and I was worried about catching some bubbles. It ends up I did, but look, we can pluck the bubbles out using some forceps, and this means that we will not have any bubbles in the future plaster castings. And now that the silicone is out, we can bevel the final 4 corners of the molds. So satisfying. Once I've beveled the edges, it's time for the mold's first bath. I take it over to the sink and get a thorough scrubbing using dish soap and a bristle brush to remove any old mold soap, any plaster residue, anything at all really that will get in the way of this silicone surface and the plaster when we start to cast our production molds. So here it is, the Silicone Master, a perfect silicone reproduction of our original monster clay Rhinoceros Hornbill. And thanks to the little notch that we put into the silicone, it makes it easy to orient and slide into its plywood home. Perfect.
We did it! We went from the sculpture to Silicone Master molds. What's next from here? Well, I'm going to cast a bunch of production molds out of plaster. I think I'm going to make 10 molds so I can cast 10 skulls a day. That's the goal, but we're going to leave that for the next episode of Tiki Technical Tuesday. I will see you then.